Good morning, everybody, and it's my great privilege to introduce Jonathon Porritt to Coastwise North Devon this morning. And for those of us with an interest in the environment and the future of the planet, Jonathon really needs no introduction, but his work in these areas has been enormous over the years, from Director of Friends of the Earth to one of the founders of Forum for the Future, and then Chairman of the UK Government's Sustainable Development Commission. I've known Jonathon for about 20 years, since my former career in banking as a sustainability manager, when he was a great influence and mentor to me on the work that I was trying to do in the bank. Jonathon continues to be an optimist for the way out of the climate emergency, as he sets it out in his new book, Hope in Hell, which I'm enjoying and which I'm sure we're going to hear more about. So without wishing to steal his thunder in any way, it's over to you, Jonathon.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. And yeah, delighted to have had the invitation to learn a little bit more about your organization, and no doubt to have my ignorance exposed about the North Devon coast. Because if you ask me any tricky questions about that, I'm afraid the answers will probably be quite brief. But and actually that is one of the challenges that I face, because I spend an awful lot of time thinking about quotes, the big picture, quotes, all of these things locked together at that big picture. But I'm more than aware of the fact that all of this ultimately comes down to what individual citizens are doing in their communities to help deliver some of the answers to the problems we're facing. Because you can generalize about this stuff and for as much as you like, but ultimately we have to make it work where we live and where we work. And that is a critical part of it. So when Martin asked me to do this, I was delighted to accept the invitation. I suppose what I'm thinking about this morning, because every day is different for sure, and every day makes me rethink some of the degree to which we can still be authentically hopeful about securing a stable climate and a stable planet in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems. Every day is a bit different. And yesterday was, I have to say, a really bad day. Yesterday, we had evidence from a scientific survey ship sailing up in the Laptev Sea in the part of the Russian Arctic. And it brought information to bear on something that scientists have been worried about for a very, very long time, which is at what point will warmer seas start to allow the release of some of the methane that is trapped in frozen sediments just offshore. So it's the equivalent of the permafrost onshore. I call it the offshore permafrost. At what point will the gradually rising temperature in the Arctic allow the methane to start bubbling up from those undersea deposits? And the levels of methane that they're detecting now are startling. And that was coupled with a second piece of information, which is at this time of the year in the Arctic, what is normally happening is that the summer melt, because every year the sea ice in the Arctic melts quite significantly in the summer. It's been getting worse and worse every year for the last 25 years, but it melts and then it begins to form again as soon as the winter, the Arctic winter kicks in. And by this time, end of October, scientists would normally expect the Arctic sea ice to be forming and coming back and beginning to do that kind of lockdown, if you like, glacial lockdown again in the Arctic waters. As of now, none of that sea ice, winter sea ice, is beginning to form. And I only draw that to your attention because for a long, long time, scientists have been saying to us, watch out for these tipping points, watch out for the time when critical ecosystems with these complex feedback loops of which they're a part, when those systems can tip. And one of the most problematic tipping point was always, is there a point at which the methane begins to be released from the permafrost and from these offshore deposits? And that's serious because there are billions of tons of methane trapped down there. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as CO2, but it's a very potent short-term gas. So what do we do? So when I wake up in the morning and I get another kind of dose of climate doom and gloom, obviously we all have to develop these survival mechanisms, ways of handling all of this, because all it does is to show us yet again that the gap between what is happening in real time, in real systems, physical planetary systems, the gap between that and what is happening politically gets wider pretty much every day. And I'm very struck by this story. It's a kind of tale of two time zones, if you like, because out there in nature, in the natural world, we are seeing an accelerated series of changes going on, not just climate induced, but a lot to do with growing vulnerabilities in critical ecosystems, which are under as great a threat as ever, impact on different species. And you all know the kind of background statistics for that in terms of 1 million species now at risk, and so on and so forth. These are unfolding, real-time, hard-edged phenomena. And then you match that against the speed of change in the political system, and the contrast sometimes is extremely painful. Now, I don't want to be too gloomy about that. Things are changing in the political system. You've probably picked up somewhere along the way that there's a big push now for what is called net zero by 2050. And even as I was writing Hope in Hell and looking at some of the inadequacies in politicians' response, I was able to look to some of the early examples about countries making commitments to a net zero economy by 2050. Net zero is simply another form of jargon. We used to call it carbon neutral, but now it's net zero. And what that means is that we have managed to reduce our emissions to the point where all the remaining emissions can be addressed via investments that we make in storing carbon in our natural systems, in our soils, in our forests, in some of our marine ecosystems, for instance, in our bogs. We forget the UK is one of the 3 most important countries in the world when it comes to bog and wetland habitat. We manage them appallingly at the moment. The government still allows burning on our peatlands and bogs, which is just an unbelievable idiocy. So net zero means we've managed down our emissions as far as we can, and the residual emissions are then offset by or compensated by these investments in natural sequestration systems. Net zero has become a big thing. The UK was the first industrial country, big OECD country, to commit to net zero by 2050. In the last week, both Japan and South Korea have committed to net zero by 2050. Pretty influenced, it has to be said, by China's ground-changing commitment to be net zero by 2060. It sounds a long way away, but China's economy is so heavily dependent on coal still today. That's a pretty astonishing ambition level they've come up with. So you could say that the politicians have got this story. They understand this now. But of course, you will all be very aware of the fact that 2050 is a remarkably reassuring date. Most of the politicians who are making net zero commitments today will definitely not be in office in 2050, and most of them will be dead. So what? And I'm only saying that somewhat harshly, because I believe now that 2050 timing, focus on 2050, is actually a displacement activity. It's getting in the way of developing action plans for the next decade. What do we need to do between now and 2030? And just to put that in context, it is remarkably simple. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us in no uncertain terms what needs to happen in the next decade, which is we need to halve emissions in a decade. So that means emissions coming down by somewhere between 6 and 7% per annum for the next 10 years. That speaks to a very different story than we're going to be net zero by 2050. And that brings me to the other comparison we have going on at the moment, of course, which is how do political systems and business systems respond to different kinds of emergencies? And we have running in parallel at the moment, we have the worst public health emergency in living memory, the worst certainly since the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War. And running alongside that, we have the climate emergency. Now, you will have noticed that these two emergencies bring forth completely different political responses. And the response to the public health emergency to COVID-19 is nothing short of remarkable. To actually watch governments the world over in their different ways respond to this public health crisis has been something that none of us could, I suspect none of us could have envisaged in any way whatsoever as an appropriate and necessary response to such a major crisis in our lives. Still, at the moment, a crisis that shows no sign of coming to an early end. You will all have your own views on when vaccination will kick in and begin to make a difference, but most of the public health, the more cautious, world-weary public health officials that I would listen to have made it very clear that nobody should expect that a vaccination program is going to make much difference until the middle of next year. So this is a long haul, to say the least. And governments will go on having to commit billions and now trillions of whatever currency it is you're talking about as the necessary response to ensure that our economies don't implode, to ensure that we don't end up with 10, 15% of our workforces unemployed, which is not unthinkable at the moment. Climate emergency, no trace of an emergency mindset, an emergency action planning process, a realization that this actually constitutes a bigger threat to more human beings over a period of time than this pandemic can possibly do. Worst case for this pandemic, it'll go to X million deaths. It's very unlikely to reach the 50 million deaths caused by the Spanish flu back in the last century. But it will be millions of people. It will be horrific. It will honestly be the biggest blow to the sense of a constantly progressing human story, if you like, that we've had in a very long time. But it is a minor incident in terms of the potential impact of runaway climate change on humankind over the course of the next decades and centuries, if humankind is still around to enjoy that kind of longevity. And I don't say that as a rhetorical flourish. The truth is, if you look at the implications of what happens if we lose this moment and really serious disruptive climate change, which is what we've got now, and we're going to live with that for the rest of our lives, literally every day. Now, we can't reverse that now. The lives of hundreds of millions of people will be negatively impacted on a rising scale for all the rest of our lives. And not just for all the rest of our lives, but for every single day of every single year that every young person on this planet will be living. That's the really shocking thing when you think about the intergenerational justice side of this. We haven't just inflicted this on ourselves. We've inflicted this on all young people today and on all young people to come. There's no escape from that. Constant disruption of a really serious kind through to the end of this century and beyond. The story, though, isn't really any longer about that disruption. That's a given. We're going to have to manage that. We're going to have to deal with it. The real story is, can we manage it in such a way that we avoid an even worse fate, which I've described in the book as runaway climate change. And that's the point when even if we threw the equivalent of a COVID-19 response at it, it wouldn't make any difference. And there would be no vaccination program waiting in the wings if we arrive in a world where runaway climate change makes it impossible for us to bring the climate back into the kind of stability that has characterized the evolution of the entire history of the human species. Big stakes. And no point turning away from that. There are some people who think that it's just too depressing, disempowering to actually contemplate that because it's too much for us average mortals to cope with. So what I tried to do in the book was to talk both about that, the reality, the truth of climate change, listening to the call from Extinction Rebellion, tell the truth, and the parallel emergency around ecosystems and biodiversity in general, which is a equally compelling and equally despairing story in many respects, is not to shy away from that, but to tell it as it is, and then say, fine, once we've got our heads round the reality of this situation, then we're in a better position to address it and deal with it than we would be otherwise. And I'm actually pretty encouraged by the degree to which people are now aware of the ways in which this twin emergency, climate and ecological emergency, need to be addressed on a very different kind of footing than the one we've had up until now. Martin referred to the work that Forum for the Future has been doing with business for the last 25 years. And if you compare the degree to which most of the world's large businesses now have not only understood the nature of these crises, much, much better, in my opinion, than most politicians, but are committed now to accelerated transitions in their own businesses to try and get to a net zero position, for instance, by 2040 rather than 2050, to begin to bring proper biodiversity action planning into the work that they're doing around the world. It's still inadequate, let's be honest, but it is there. It's only when you look at that opportunity to make these huge changes that you can begin to draw down on what I call authentic hope. And although Martin described me in his introduction as optimistic, I'm not really optimistic, Martin. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm what I call a realistically hopeful person. Hopeful in as much as I still subscribe to the idea that knowledge is the precursor of any responsible course of action. And that once we have understood the full implications of the science of what's happening, we have a better chance then of moving both decision makers and citizens into a greater readiness to change the way we do things, change the way we create wealth, change the way we organize ourselves in our communities and in society, change our relationship with the natural world, and begin to develop the kind of mature, compassionate, intelligent way of living on this planet that has always been available to us, but got lost decades ago in the obsessive pursuit of economic growth at all costs. And that, of course, is the tricky bit. I could go and try and cheer you up in all sorts of different ways. I'm just going to try two things very quickly before we open up for more wide-ranging discussion. The first is technology. Now, this is a complicated thing. There are an awful lot of people in the environment movement who do not like the idea that technology is probably the principal reason why we need to be more rather than less hopeful about a sustainable future. But honestly, for the first time in my life now, I can talk enthusiastically about the dramatic transformation that is going to happen in all of our lives as a consequence of technology. And that is essentially because of what's happening with renewable energies, solar and wind, and now the third bit of that technology stool, if you like, storage, batteries. Not exactly the sexiest technology in the world, unless you're Elon Musk, of course, who gets very excited by batteries. But the combination of these three technologies, solar, wind, and storage, is extraordinary. And every year for the last 15 years now, we've seen the price of these technologies come down every year by somewhere between 6 and 8% every year. There is no indication that prices are going to stop coming down. And what that means is within a very few years, maybe no more than 2 to 3 years now, that combination, solar, wind, and storage, will compete in the open market against any other source of electricity generation, in its own terms, subsidy-free, in the rich world and in the poor world. Because the really important thing about this is these technologies are not just of a kind that help the already rich in the rich world. They are transformational, indeed revolutionary, in terms of their impact on the lives of some of the poorest people in the world. And though I'm no great defender of Narendra Modi, Mr. Modi in India, the fact that he does properly understand the liberatory effect of off-grid solar power for hundreds of millions of people in India is actually very inspiring. I wish he brought the same kind of insights to bear on the rest of his godforsaken politics, which I'm afraid is doing a great deal of harm to many, many Indian citizens today. If you wanted to do an emergency story for the climate, equivalent to the emergency response that we're making to the pandemic, it would be possible to provide every single human being on this planet with renewable electricity by 2030. That is not science fiction. It's completely doable. The technologies are completely understood. There is a huge amount of capital in the world out there which could be deployed to do this. And off that foundation, which is sustainable electricity generation, then you can work through to other aspects of the energy economy. Heat, for instance, which is much more complicated. Transport, which is complicated. Energy and carbon intensive manufacturing, steel, cement, and so on. It gets more complicated as you dig in, but you have to have, as a foundational start here, you have to be able to talk of 100% renewable electricity. I've been at this game since 1972, as Martin said, and there are many times in which I've summoned up hope in alternative technologies, often knowing full well that what I was talking about was a very thin little will-o'-the-wisp indeed, because the technologies couldn't bear the weight of those expectations in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It started first decade of this century. But right now, I can put my hand on my heart and say, if we really wanted to do that, we can do it. The second thing is completely different. And that is the importance of young people in this discussion. And for me, thinking back to the end of 2019, and I managed to work this into the book because I finished the book, in fact, in March this year, just as COVID began to impact on all of our lives as dramatically as we now understand. I don't think I understood then, but I had a feel for what might happen. But I was still full of the astonishing uplift from what happened in 2019, when a combination of different civil society initiatives in our country made such a huge difference, not just Extinction Rebellion, which I think is significant, but more particularly the school strikes and young climate activists injecting their energy into the very tired world of climate debates and climate politics and all the rest of it, inspired in no small part by the incredible leadership of Greta Thunberg and everything that she brought to bear on that. Now, this year, 2020, much of that young energy has disappeared. It's been a hellish year for most young people, very difficult to pursue their concerns about climate, about social justice, about racial inequality, very difficult to do it in the way that they were doing it in 2019. We have to hope that 2021 brings that young energy back into our midst again, because that will be critically important. So all sorts of reasons to be very hopeful about this, genuinely. My own sense is it is not too late to avoid that horror story of runaway climate change. But as I've tried to make very clear today, and in all the sort of advocacy that I'm using at the moment, it won't be not too late for very much longer. Because if we don't get on with this now, then it will rapidly turn into a too late scenario in which it'll be next to impossible to avoid that really miserable fate for humankind. So hopefully that's established something of a balancing act. It's always difficult to do that because what we learn about the climate on a daily basis and what we learn about the state of the planet on a daily basis is difficult to deal with, actually. But we do have to balance that with the recognition of the amazing things that are happening in society at the moment. So Martin, I'll leave it there and let the conversation go where you all want it to go, as long as it isn't into too much detail, as I said, about the wonderful North Devon coastline, which I am not able to answer questions on.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a very, very fascinating summary of the position we're now in, and I think it's of concern to all of us. And I know people will want to have a say. And one of the first questions is one from Reen. So, Reen, if you're able to unmute, you ask the question yourself. Are you able to do that?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Thank you very much for talk. I really appreciate that, and it's good to hear someone talking about this very clearly. I wonder, with the growth of the renewables and the drop in prices of renewable energy and the coming of battery storage and all that, is there still any need for nuclear energy with all its risk that are attached to that, its very long lead times and its incredible cost?
I've never been enthusiastic about nuclear energy. I have to admit, my own personal background, I got involved in the Green Party in 1974 at the same time as I joined CND. So I've always been an anti-nuclear campaigner, both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And that didn't mean to say that I wasn't open to the possibility of nuclear energy being part of a solutions portfolio. And I used to get into terrible trouble when I was director of Friends of the Earth in the 1980s, because I would say, look, okay, we're not in favor of nuclear energy now because it's not doing the job we need it to do. But that doesn't mean to say you can rule out nuclear energy forever. You can't declare a technology to be wicked or in some way irrelevant for all time. If the story changes, if the barriers to nuclear power genuinely supporting the low carbon economy we need without some of the risks, if all of that changes, then you've got to be open to that change. And I must admit, most local Friends of the Earth groups thought that was definitively, that was heresy. That was heresy. So I haven't always been popular in this, but I've watched as the years go by, and of course, none of these barriers has been resolved. We still have ludicrous financial implications associated with nuclear energy. It is so much more expensive now that as a way of generating low carbon electrons. It used to be the case that we were told we would need nuclear for baseload generation. The national grid here in the UK has said we don't need nuclear for baseload generation. We will be able to configure our grid differently with this amount of renewables on the system. Doesn't mean to say we can instantly get out of all our dependence on gas. That'll take a slightly longer period of time. People used to say that we absolutely have to have nuclear because it's the only large scale low carbon technology available to us. And we now know that really isn't the case. Offshore wind farms now are astonishing feats of engineering. I may be heading into tricky territory because I know a lot of people who live in coastal areas sometimes get a little bit upset about these expressions of the future, as I call them, these incredible offshore wind farms that we have now, which are transforming, by the way, the UK's entire approach to sustainable energy systems. And on every count, we see that nuclear cannot put a tick in the box. The last one, to be honest, is on nuclear waste. And for me, when I got involved in nuclear issues in the 1970s, I was told there was a solution around the corner for all nuclear waste. And it was just a question of getting the technologies sorted out. And hey presto, we'd be able to deal with this. Well, nearly 50 years on, we still don't have solutions to nuclear waste issues. And for me, it is utterly immoral to impose a technology on future generations for which there is as yet no financially affordable set of solutions, technologically or financially available solutions. So I don't see nuclear playing any part in this. And I think we're going to have to suffer from Hinkley Point, I'm sorry to say, although I won't go on about this, but my own best bet is that Hinkley Point will never be finished. I think EDF will be a bankrupt company long before Hinkley Point actually starts to generate any electricity. And that saddens me if you think of the massive waste of resources. And, oh my God, the amount of carbon dioxide represented in all that concrete that has been poured and so on and so forth. Oh, it's just too shocking to think about. I don't think Hinkley Point will ever be commissioned, frankly. But nonetheless, it is the part of the nuclear industry that everybody is looking to now, apart from small modular reactors. And let's not talk about those today.
Okay, well, do you want to come back on that, Reen, or you?
No, that's great. I fully agree, and I'm hopeful that Hinkley never happens.
Yeah, indeed. Now we've got another question here for you from my old colleague Steve Pitcher, who has served a long time on the AONB partnership, and is a former planning officer, and he's got a question about Extinction Rebellion for you. Steve, are you unmuted?
Yes, thank you, Martin. Jonathan, a couple of us here are XR activists, me only at a local scale. My question is, how disruptive do you think we have to get before the government takes action at a scale and urgency commensurate with the severity of the climate and ecological crisis?
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess what made Hope in Hell such a difficult book for me to write, which it was the realization that right now, the kind of campaigning that we have in the UK and in every other country, this kind of pressing the incremental button, as I call it, a little bit of progress here and another initiative over there and 10 million pounds here and whatever it might be. That kind of incremental approach to climate change cannot possibly make the difference fast enough, cannot shift things fast enough. So in the book, I've written a lot about the importance of civil disobedience, the necessity of nonviolent direct action. For me, going back to my roots, I guess, the Green Party has always supported the appropriate use of nonviolent direct action in order to ensure more benign societal outcomes when the system is no longer capable of delivering them. And I think XR has been really instrumental in reminding people that the history of democracy is a history where nobody in power gives up things readily. They only give those things up or change the way they do things when they are obliged to do so from outside. So for me, the next 10 years will be characterized by growing levels of civil disobedience of a different kind, including nonviolent direct action. That is going to be a personal commitment of mine. I know that you can't advocate for a societal shift of that kind if you're not prepared to be part of it oneself. And for me, that means a very different way of thinking about my role as an advocate and campaigner in the future. And for young people, I don't want to dump the burden of this on young people, but for them, as they contemplate this story of the whole of the rest of their lives being even more severely disrupted through climate change, it's inevitable that young people will continue to rely on civil disobedience of one kind or another as they take their own campaigning activities forward. So I think it's crucial. I don't know what your feeling is about that. I think Extinction Rebellion had a bit of a misstep at the end of 2019. It ended the year, funnily enough, with a lot of people feeling, oh, I don't know about that. That's not sure about where this is going. I think this year, 2020, I actually think XR has come back in a stronger form. I hate to have to say this, but I think COVID-19 was probably the best thing that could have happened to Extinction Rebellion, because it forced it to look more carefully at ways in which you can bring people with you, ways in which you avoid alienating people, because you have to do that. You have to make sure this is something that has wide societal support, even as you do things that some, obviously, not just some, I suspect quite a lot of people in society will not be comfortable with. Breaking the law is not something that people automatically feel comfortable about, even if the need is very great indeed. So I see XR as a pretty critical part of the total campaigning spectrum. And I'm sure that we will see much more of this over the next few years.
Right, thanks for that. Okay, Steve, on that one? Yeah, good stuff. Now, Jonathan, there's just a quick one from Ruth Turner that I'll read out, Ruth, if you don't mind. She says, you haven't mentioned tidal energy.
Well, I did wonder whether I'd get a question on tidal energy.
From a group like this, yeah.
Yes, well, there's no reason why any of you should know about my record on tidal energy, but when I was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, we were actually commissioned by the government to do a very detailed look at tidal power in general, not just the tidal barrage, but lagoons and all the rest of it. And after a long, and I must say extremely intense process, we came to the conclusion that a tidal barrage was not just desirable, but necessary. And I won't rehash the totality of all the arguments. Our report is still available. We did it on the basis that this would be roughly 9% of the equivalent of baseload electricity generation that we need, which would last for decades. We did it on the grounds that actually the Severn estuary itself is a funny old ecosystem, and people have different views about the Severn and different views about the biodiversity and the richness of the estuary and so on. But our view was that the Severn estuary was going to be subject to massive damage as a consequence of rising sea levels, and that damage would cause many, many more problems for the ecosystems which depend on the Severn, because it's a whole set of systemic effects, obviously, across the whole watershed. That damage would be increasingly problematic through rising sea levels and storm surges. And one of the pieces of work that we commissioned is what benefits would a barrage have on helping to manage more effectively those precious ecosystems up the Severn into the Wye and so on. As we now contemplate the inevitability, this is an extraordinary position we're in now. So again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will bring out its next report in 2022, big assessment report in 2022. But we already know from a special report they did last year that we will be facing a minimum of a 1 meter sea level rise, average 1 meter sea level rise by the end of this century. That is the minimum. That is the best case. It will be no less than 1 meter. And that is an average. And it means that some parts of the world will be affected much more seriously than the 1 meter, and some parts will be affected less seriously. Worst case, according to the Intergovernmental Panel, 2 meters. Now, I don't need to spell out to you what that means for many, many parts of the world. I mean, the consequences of this are truly horrendous to think about. But even if you were dealing with a 1 meter sea level rise by the end of this century, there's a hell of a lot of coastal areas in the UK that are going to be subject to really massive impacts, affecting not just the biodiversity of those areas, but of course, communities, economies, people's lives to a quite dramatic extent. So I'm sticking to my guns on the tidal barrage. I know it's deeply controversial. I love my arguments with my beloved colleagues in RSPB, WWF, Friends of the Earth, Wildlife Trust. Stack them all up, they're all against it. I don't believe they've actually considered the inevitability now of the Severn estuary being a massively disrupted ecosystem, whether they like it or not. And the only story is how best do you minimize the damage that that disruption is going to do.
Okay, well, that's strong stuff there, Jonathan. Thanks for that. I've got another question here for you on from Irene, who's a colleague on the AONB. So a couple of us here. Irene, do you want to talk about, ask your question direct to Jonathan rather than me rambling through it?
Yeah, I won't turn the video on because it freezes the system. You know that, Martin.
I do.
So, yeah. So you've nearly answered the question already, but what I was going to go on and ask you is, what would you do if you were Prime Minister about the humans that are living in the at-risk areas of flooding and sea level rise? You're going to compulsory purchase them or let them fall into the sea, or?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, Irene, because the implication for tens of thousands of people in the first instance, and beyond that in the second half of the century, hundreds of thousands of people in the UK is extraordinary. And there will be different responses that will be necessary in different parts of the country. Sometimes, I think what is called managed retreat will be the best available way of handling this. And I'm a little bit familiar with some of the managed retreat initiatives going on the east side of the country. where the problems are already grave, as you will know. And the only alternative really is to allow some of those incursions from rising sea level to take back control over quite significant areas of land, which will become marshy areas again, certainly unfit for the kind of intensive agriculture which we've seen in those parts of the world. It won't be impossible to have human habitation in those areas, but it'll be hard. In other parts of the country, especially where you've got much steeper terrain and you've got cliffs and areas with a subject to dramatic impacts through storm surges in particular, I'm hoping that there will be a government strategy on this, which will allow for support for communities in those very precarious conditions, and that we will get better at enabling people in advance of their properties being either destroyed or, of course, reduced to zero value, because there will come a time where the impact of this rising sea level on many, many homes very close to the ocean, to the sea, will mean that those homes no longer have any financial value at all. We could sit back and just say, well, tough, you shouldn't have gone and lived in such a beautiful place looking out over the sea, and it's the market economy and caveat emptor and all that. You could have read up about a 1 meter sea level rise for all these years. Bad luck. I don't think that is a compassionate or humane way of doing it. And all I know is that we will need a government strategic response, which will allow for management strategies of different kinds in different parts of the country, whatever that might look like. But I just hope we don't wait until the pain of this impact on our lives becomes so grave that the government does something belatedly and probably very inadequately, when it could have done something really quite intelligent and smart in advance of it happening.
Which would you do?
I want to see, as you can imagine, I want to see this strategic approach. I know a little bit about the Environment Agency's approach to this, which has been widely criticized, but they have at least established the story that you have to do this there's no one size fits all for loss of land and loss of human habitation from rising sea level. It has to be done on a piecemeal basis, if you like, stretch of coastline by stretch of coastline. And I suspect most of you would, for instance, be much better informed about what that means for your coastline than any other set of experts.
Yeah, we've actually got a piece of, if you like, managed realignment going on just in the estuary here, the Tor and Torridge estuary.
Right.
Where we've got salt marsh emerging, and interestingly, Devon Wildlife Trust is working with Triodos Bank to create an investment opportunity for the carbon sequestration offered by salt marsh, which is leading edge stuff. And
that is leading edge stuff.
Yeah,
I love it. Biogeoengineering.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's, hey, you're on the cutting edge, guy.
Happens without any human intervention whatsoever. It's really good stuff.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary.
And there's another great question here from Debbie. Debbie, are you unmuted? About people caring and doing things, but there are more people who don't seem to be aware. You would like to put the question?
Yes, please. I think I'm a bit like you, Jonathan. I'm sort of hopeful in a lot of ways, and it's good to see lots more people getting on board with changes. But I've still got this worry that the majority of people, it's not on their radar. They don't seem to know that they live on a planet with finite resources. My question is really, how can we all be getting these people on board and sharing messages? Not just governments, but everybody.
Yeah. Yes, it's pretty startling, isn't it? You can't imagine. It's hard to imagine a more impactful set of climate stories from around the world than the stories we have now. I mean, this year alone has been totally astonishing, starting with the wildfires in Australia, and worst wildfires ever in their history. 3 billion, they now know that somewhere close to 3 billion creatures died in those wildfires, not the initial 1 billion they indicated. We've seen astonishing flooding in 6 or 7 countries, including at one point 50% of Bangladesh being submerged in floods. We've seen the wildfires in California. I could go on. And you think to yourself, oh, God, bloody hell, okay, line all that lot up. And what is it about that data set that leaves you in any doubt that this is now a massively impactful story in all of our lives now, not in the future, but now? How do you read that? And there's something which they've done a lot of work in America called the proximity principle. And it's really a fascinating bit of research, because what it demonstrates is that in those states of America which have been really seriously affected by climate-induced disasters, so particularly Florida, California, Oregon, parts of the Midwest, which have experienced flooding of the kind that the country has never, ever seen, last year and again this year, in parts of the country where you have this irrefutable physical evidence of climate-induced economic and human impact, the views change dramatically. And in all of those states that have been radically affected by climate disasters, there is no debate about the science of climate change. They want their politicians to be doing more at both state level and federal level. In those states which have never had the experience that those affected by it have, then they're still pretty indifferent. They're still subscribing to the view, well, climate may be changing, but it's very unlikely that human emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, have got anything to do with it. It's just a natural phenomenon. They're still subscribing to that notion that even though it's happening, it's probably not a man-made phenomenon. And that's all to do with the proximity. As soon as your family is directly affected, as soon as your community is directly affected, as soon as friends or relatives living in another part of that country are affected, then the perceptions of people change. Now, the awful consequence of this is, as you can see where my logic is taking us, is we need a shed load more people whose lives have been directly and sometimes dramatically affected by climate-induced disasters. And that's a terrible thing to have to say, because really we ought to be smart enough not to need more and more people whose lives are devastated by climate change to take the requisite actions to address that. But it seems we're not at that point of enlightenment as yet, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Jonathan, I don't remember when we were up there in Scotland, you made us fill in these albums of thoughts about what we were talking about. We were there, a group of sustainability managers from companies like BP and BT and, well, Halifax, good old Halifax, where I was working.
Yep.
And you charged us with sort of putting down our thoughts in these wonderful albums that I thought I'd get it out this morning and see, well, what was he banging on about 20 years ago? And one thing that struck me was that the whole thing was called Reconnections, and you pointed to the flawed concept of the separateness of humanity, that we're kind of hardwired to think of ourselves as humans and not as part of the overall biodiversity of all forms of life or being. And I'm wondering whether, linked to Debbie's question, whether we should deal with the more strongly the biodiversity, which clearly we as a group feel very strongly about, making it clear that humans are part of all this, that we as a human species have a responsibility to the other species. And can we kind of link biodiversity and the climate emergencies together and make it, the advocacy that Attenborough is doing on biodiversity in particular seems to have a very powerful resonance that seems to flood out the climate message to some extent. People seem to get that, but can we link it more together?
Yeah, I'm nervous about prioritizing one over the other. I think it's very interesting that the new bill that XR and other campaigners are trying to bring forward today is called the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. So it's basically saying these are twin emergencies. We have to think of them in a very similar way, that they're both demonstrating flaws in the wealth creating system that we depend on today. Very, very intense flaws, as it were, causing more and more mayhem in human society. But I don't want to turn away from the key point that you raised there, Martin, which is this issue about how we are able more successfully to keep people connected to, linked into, deeply embedded in the natural world. And just before the meeting started, I was mentioning that I spent the first 10 years of my life as a teacher in a comprehensive school in Shepherd's Bush in London. And it pretty quickly became apparent to me that none of the kids in our school had any access to the natural world whatsoever. And coming from the White City estates or other catchment areas, it was barren. It was a desert in terms of opportunities to think about their links to the natural world. So we did a tiny bit. We used to take mini vans full of kids twice a year to a Welsh farm and try and instill a little bit of understanding and sometimes even awe at what the natural world meant for them in those urban contexts. But even in rural areas, and I'm maybe treading outside my comfort zone here, even in rural areas, we know that a lot of kids are not connected in to their natural environment today. They're often more connected with the technosphere through their devices than they are to the biosphere through their ability to experience that directly through the senses. And this is a huge struggle, and it does go back to education. My sense is we've allowed our education system to turn away from all the opportunities we had to embed kids, young people in the natural world, to make them feel or allow them to continue to feel deeply about the natural world. We all know that when they're younger, kids respond to it, feel wedded to the natural world anyway. It doesn't take a great deal to remind ourselves that we are animals, basically, when you look at how kids play in the natural world. But bit by bit, we beat that out of them, or we allow that to disappear, and it gets taken over by all sorts of different mechanisms, not least, unfortunately, the fear that some adults have of letting their children be outside these days, which has been devastating. So I've done a lot of work on this over the years, Martin, as you know, and very keen often to put into the work that we do with corporates, well, what are you doing about making it possible for people to have access to better green spaces, even if it is in an urban context?
Yeah.
And the health data about this, no time to talk about this at length, but the improvement in people's physical and mental health through access to and involvement in the natural world is staggering. You look at the hard-edged evidence of better health outcomes, the more time people can spend in the natural world is astonishing. I'm president of something called the Conservation Volunteers, which essentially provides opportunities for people to be in the natural world doing practical conservation work together with other people. And the impact on people's mental health in particular is astonishing. And I don't know, we don't make much of that evidence. Our National Health Service is very far from being a natural health service, which I think it could so easily be. Yeah. And I would love to see more of that coming into our understanding of how to manage health systems more effectively.
Yeah. Well, again, we've got a project on that with the health service here in North Devon, looking at the issue, getting people, they can be prescribed a course
exactly.
of walking out on the coast. Now, Paula, you've got a question, I think, about the international dimension. Have you got it there ready?
I'm interested in international measures that I think we should be targeting, and I've always thought that these issues are just too big to be dealt with at local level, though at local level we must all do what we can, and Rob and I try to. But which are the international organisations that we should be targeting or looking to have moved in some way, perhaps by our politicians? Are they like United Nations type organizations? Are they business organizations like the World Trade Organization, or are they perhaps the universities? There must be international organizations that should be expected to have a response that they should be able to go public with, and that should lead public opinion.
There are indeed, Paula. There's no doubt about that. And there's a lot of campaigning work that goes on to try and bring those institutions into a more cognizant role of these issues to do with biodiversity, climate, and so on, with some effect. So if you look, for instance, at the positioning of the World Bank and the IMF, so two key, what are called the Bretton Woods institutions, they have moved a long way in the last 10 years. From having been in a state of almost complete denial about the significance of these natural system phenomena, you can check now with the sort of current practices of both the World Bank and the IMF, and theoretically at least, they are much more attuned to the need to think about financial systems, loans, grants, etc., in a way that is more sympathetic to the natural world and to a stable climate. The World Bank, actually, let's not go on too much detail about the World Bank. It's still got a long way to go. But the UN itself, of course, about which we have a lot of concerns. If the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent something like it. The problem about the UN is not the UN. The problem about the UN is national governments, because the whole mechanism for the UN's intervention through all of its different agencies, whether you're talking about environment program or development program or World Health Organization, whatever it might be, is it operates only at the behest of member countries. And having had a rogue nation in the form of the United States, laying waste much of the UN's infrastructure over the last 4 years with a level of hostility that nobody has ever seen before, it's incredibly difficult for the UN to be as effective as it needs to be in creating these opportunities for a different way of organizing nations more collaboratively. So at almost every turn, you can point to ways in which these big global institutions are being influenced, are changing their ways, but it's very slow. And if you ask me, they're usually at least a decade behind what it is that the science has been telling us. And that decade now represents the difference between in time, just in time, admittedly, and not being in time. So it's a critical part of the total picture for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, but it's now coming up to 11 o'clock. I'm aware that you have another appointment quite soon. So I'm going to have to bring it to a close at that point. But I would like to thank you very much for spending so much time with us here. And it's been wonderful that you've been able to do it without having to travel and get on your bicycle. I hope you're still riding a bike. I remember one got stolen when we were doing something in London. And
still riding my bike, Martin, you'll be pleased to know. In fact, the only time that I've been up to London, I live in Cheltenham, as I mentioned, the only time I've been up to London over the course of the last 6 months has been to get my bike back from London and reacquaint myself with my bike. I have an exercise bike as well, which I use assiduously, but I was missing my bike. So I took the train up to London, picked up my bike, put it on the train and came back again. That was about as much London as I could cope with.
Yeah, I remember the managers at Halifax when we were having to work in Scotland. They always used to laugh at me riding into York Station and putting my bike on the train.
Yeah, no.
I hope they're not laughing now, as they say.
Exactly. Exactly.
One of the things that just finish on one of the comments you made to us 20 years ago at that group of industrial figures, you said we must keep our values fierce and become thought warriors. And I think, you know, that I've always felt that. And people say, Martin, you seem to be very committed to this climate change business, but that's because I think you really need to believe in it before you can get people to change things. And I hope you've managed to convince even more of us that it's down to all of us to make the changes and to do the persuasion and be influencers in our own way, even if it's just with our own family.
Exactly. Exactly. Start there, and who knows where that will take us in due course.
Thank you very much indeed.
Not at all. Very nice to be with you for an hour, and good luck in all your endeavors. They may seem small, but boy, are they critical. So, thanks.
Thank you,
very
Jonathan.
much.
Thanks a lot.